is part of Rebel Wisdom's series, The Science and Psychology of Polarization. Scientist Stephen Porges came up with a revolutionary theory that links together psychology, neuroscience, and evolutionary biology. It was called Polivagal and focused on the vagus, the longest nerve in the body, that links together all the major organs and also connects to the face and voice. For the first time, there was a theory that explained how our own body and mind are intimately connected to our facial expressions, voice, and social engagement system, and therefore to others. How the vagus nerve moderates experiences of trust and safety, how we're curious and open to new information and experiences, and how, if we're not feeling safe, then we fall into defensiveness. We start to see everything unfamiliar as a threat, and are unable to take in new information. So, Stephen, thank you very much for making the time for this interview.
No, David, thank you very much for inviting me.
So, in this interview, I'm really interested to talk about how your theory, polyvagal theory, applies to the polarization that we're seeing around us. Could you outline what is polyvagal theory and how does it apply to this subject?
Polyvagal theory, from the perspective of our dialogue, is a neurobiological theory that enables us to understand why and how humans need to connect with each other. And if we don't connect with each other, what are the consequences, both to our body, meaning our physiology and our health, but also to our mental health. It's basically a theory that explains brain-body relationships and how we can manipulate our mental perspective by shifts in our body, and how our mental perspective can change our body and vice versa. It's a model that has bidirectionality between brain and body, and it enables us to, in a sense, create a science of how social behavior supports health and how being healthy enables us to be more social.
Just to talk about what polyvagal theory actually means in practice, just like to sort of break that down in terms of the vagus nerve, and in a very simple way, how do we orient ourselves, and how does polyvagal theory illustrate that orienting process?
Polyvagal theory has several features, and we're going to go through a few of them. The first important one is that it gives us a way of organizing our own bodily reactions, and it really emphasizes that the neural, which really means the brain regulation of the autonomic nervous system, the neural system that regulates the organs within our body, followed an evolutionary trajectory. So we had a very primitive autonomic system that really was about maintaining metabolic resources. So it was very much oriented in, if there wasn't enough oxygen, enough food, it just kind of shut us down. Okay. Then with evolution from these ancient vertebrates that had only one, a very ancient old vagal circuit, and that old vagal circuit was unmyelinated. And myelination is really the fatty substance that coats a nerve, and if it's myelinated, it can actually convey these signals more efficiently and more specifically. But in the very ancient vertebrates, they only had this older dorsal vagal system. But we still have it. It's the primary system that still goes to our gut. And the major defense response that the autonomic nervous system for these ancient vertebrates was basically shutting down, immobilizing, death feigning. Through evolution, a sympathetic nervous system came on board, and that one was a spinal sympathetics that came on with the bony fish, and you can see them moving and even stopping. So now you have an autonomic balance of mobilization through the sympathetic nervous system and an immobilization of that old vagus. And then what you have with mammals, and this is the interesting part of polyvagal theory, is something strange and something miraculous that occurs with the transition from the ancient extinct reptiles to mammals. And that is, you have a newer vagal circuit that's myelinated that helps calm or coordinate the older vagal circuit to support homeostasis and to enable sympathetics to work without getting you into fight or flight. But the other miraculous part is that the area of the brain that regulates that pathway of the vagus is not the same that regulates the old vagus going to the gut. It's linked to the nerves in the area of the brainstem. It's linked to the part that regulates the nerves that regulate your face, the muscles of your face and head. It regulates your social engagement system, your ingestive system, the way you touch and connect with the world. So it's really this kind of remarkable transition where our heart became connected in a neural way to the nerves that regulated our voice, the intonation of our voice, our facial expressions, and even our ability to extract information by listening. So there are muscles in our middle ear, our facial expressivity, and the intonation of our voice. So now we project our heart in our voice, and people know that. Intuitively they respond that way. We project our feelings in our face. So these become the important parts of how we make connections with others. But the bidirectionality, so that we're, in a sense, if a person is in a physiological destabilized way, their voice is very different. And we often, if we're good therapists or good human beings or good parents or good teachers, we know that. And we calm them. And how do we calm them? It's not the words that are powerful. It's how we use the words. It's the intonation of our voice. So polyvagal theory emphasizes these evolutionary stages, but also emphasizes that under challenge, under demands that could be illness or threat, our autonomic nervous system shifts state. It moves from this social engagement, safe state, and where we are connected with others, it moves to defensive states. And we have two defensive states. And this is really one of the important points of polyvagal theory. Prior to polyvagal theory, most people thought we only had one defensive state, and that was a stress or a fight-flight sympathetic state. And even people who had been traumatized, who had been immobilized by the trauma, their therapists would say, oh, you must have been frightened, you must have been mobilized, but they kept on looking for this sympathetic response. And the client said, that's not how I experienced it. That's because when we experience a life threat, for some of us, not all of us, our body goes into this very, very ancient immobilization response. We're very much like a mouse in the jaws of a cat, where the mouse will just literally pass out and lose all muscle tone. And many people who have survived trauma, their body has gone into that state, and they've not found a voice or had difficulty finding a voice to explain the mechanisms of it. So frequently under demands, our bodies don't support fight or flight. And in our culture, when we don't have that resource, the people are often blamed for not fighting or not fleeing. And so by explaining this with polyvagal theory, it provides a validation for many people's experiences.
And how does that apply to polarization and to connection?
Let's start with this whole notion. You have polarization in part because there is some type of threat that people perceive or their bodies respond. So let's now deal with this notion of threat from a polyvagal perspective. Polyvagal theory doesn't like to use words like perception because perception is a very cognitive term. Polyvagal theory uses a term called neuroception, which is the nervous system's decision or evaluation of risk in the environment. So if your nervous system detects risk of danger, you shift physiological state to be more sympathetically innervated, which gives you the power and strength to run or to fight. If you react as if there's no way you can get out, like you're enclosed in a small area, or you're physically much smaller, or your body might now move into this life threat shutting down response. Both of those are autonomic responses, and our body has this capacity to go to those stages in an adaptive strategy to save our lives. So it's not like, oh, I gave up, so I just shut down. Now I'm really angry that I gave up. Your body is making that decision, and once you understand that these are more on a neural reflex level, then aspects of shame and blame change. But let's move back to this notion of perceived threat or a neuroception of threat. If we have a neuroception of threat, our nervous system loses its capacity to be socially engaged with others. So we start to see others with a bias of threatening us. And then this goes into the next level, the issue of the world that we're in now, which is a very polarized world. that we have confused what it means to be safe. And that's part of where the polarization occurs. The polarization starts when people think that I can be safe if I remove threat. If I see you as threatening, you're not coming into my country, you're not coming into my town, you're not marrying my daughter. You know, all these features are basically, we're going to remove the threat. But that's not enough. Our bodies want more. That will never make an individual or a community or a society feel safe. Safety comes when the features of safety are being presented to them on a day-to-day basis. The ability of people engaging them, smiling at them with positive gestures, the intonations of voices that are reassuring and witnessing, those make people feel safe. So it's not merely the politics. We have to also talk about educational systems. We have to talk about medical care. How often do the educators, how often are they instructed, or the medical providers instructed, that the way they look at the students or their patients, the way they use their voice, is as important as everything else they do. It's not part of the curriculum, and that's what I think polyvagal theory could bring to medical treatments and to education, is the understanding that if you want people to get better, if you want people to learn, they have to feel safe in the context in which you're delivering your services.
And how does this theory or theoretical framework apply to, say, conflict and mediation?
Well, it defines conflict, doesn't it, in terms of that in conflict, so people feel that there is a threat, or their bodies feel there's a threat. To have remediation, you have to provide sufficient cues of safety so that you now get into a dialogue. Now, a dialogue, by nature of even the word, implies some reciprocity in the interaction. And when you have reciprocity in the action, you have a listening component as well as expressive component. So you have a witnessing component. So part of, I think, the major issue of conflict is that people don't listen to each other. So they're not witnessing. And if people don't listen to you when you try to talk or express something, or let's say you're even a child and you're not being listened to, what happens to your physiological state? You become very uncomfortable, you become frustrated, and as you get older with those same feelings, you become angry and belligerent. And so we have to understand that being listened to, being witnessed, not necessarily being agreed with, but being witnessed and appreciated for what you're saying, is really part of our birthright. It's something that we scream to have. And polarization occurs when people aren't listened to, they're not witnessed, and they feel marginalized.
And where do you see that happening at the moment in culture?
I see it happening slowly. I see, to me, for my own experience, the shock has been the interest in my own ideas, in the ideas of the polyvagal theory, and the fact that people in education, people in medicine, and even people in philosophy became interested in it. So it's not merely the psychologists or the neuroscientists, that people who are living their lives said, this is an interesting theory, it explains my experiences. Or what I would say to them, it provides them with a validation of their own intuitions. And I think what that is saying to me is that as we understand the neurobiology of what it is to be a human being, when that becomes our guide, then culture and life becomes better. I put on one of my slides a couple of days ago a kind of modification of what DuPont, the chemical company, used to advertise better living through chemistry. That was their slogan. And what I was saying was really maybe better living through understanding neurobiology, better living through neurobiology. And what polyvagal theory is saying, better living through neurobiology. So rather than always thinking that our behaviors are all based upon intentionality, that we have a more sophisticated understanding that we have a role, and the role is to support our own biology, and that neurobiology is supported for being a human in terms of co-regulation or social interactions. What it teaches us is that to be healthy, we have to do lots of interactions, not all the time, but we have to have opportunities. And what that means is that what used to be called we like to call play. Play is a neural exercise. Social communication with each other is a neural exercise. And they have certain principles. One, they're synchronous in real time together, and the other is they have reciprocity. And the world we're in with social media and texting and all these other ways of communicating has ruined the synchronous and often the reciprocal aspects of it. And our nervous system gets retuned by lack of the available exercises. So as people are listening, I hope that the educational model starts to shift so that we start providing more opportunities for children at earlier ages to have neural exercises of these systems. Because when those systems of neural regulation start becoming more, say, more tuned, more powerful, more efficient, we have better behavioral state regulation. And behavioral state regulation is really the basis upon which we can negotiate or talk to others, and the basis upon which we can learn. So we can't sit in a classroom unless we can regulate our state. And we are starting to find out really that lots of disorders, including addictive behaviors, which are massive in our culture, are really disorders of state regulation. So polyvagal theory provides a different perspective for many of the attributes of mental illness and mental health.
And you just touched on it a little bit, but social media, and if polyvagal theory is all about the necessity for face-to-face contact and for regulating ourselves in connection with other people, what does social media do to that when we're basically communicating through a screen and we're...
Well, it's an interesting question, because for those of us who initially, our early part of our lives was really solely face-to-face, even the telephone wasn't that bad because we could tell by intonation of voice. I have found that Skype is better than just talking. So, and I have become more comfortable with interviews even on Skype or Zoom. So these types of social media technologies are infiltrating our life. I don't think they replace the one-to-one interaction. I often like to say that we don't have to have these one-to-one interactions all the time, but we need to have some of it. So if we have a good nervous system, if our nervous system has been well developed with, let's say, good parenting, good friends, good social interactions, it gives us the resilience to then go off and do things on our own, to be bolder, to be more creative, and not to need constant co-regulation. So there's almost a paradox. The more opportunities you have as you develop, the more resilient you are as you grow up, and the more bold and you can do things.
But is there a problem with social media and the sort of the low bandwidth? We're not face-to-face much of the time. It's very... Do you think it adds to the kind of division or isolation that we're experiencing?
I think it adds to a misunderstanding of cues. Where people are misunderstanding what people are saying, and they may be listening more to the words and less to the facial expressivity and the intonation. I think there are false cues coming out there. But I have children, and they are adults now, and they would argue with me that social media plays a positive role in their lives, and that they have friendships that are maintained because of social media. And they use it in a different way than I would use it. I'm not comfortable with using it. Like, I don't use Twitter, and it's just not my world. I use email a lot, and I do text occasionally. But I think it is a narrower bandwidth, and it could be useful if we have relationships already, so maintaining them. But I think where my kids are using it is really maintaining relationships with the individuals they had worked with before or gone to school with